everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is the Better Sweater series. This is installment number 5, and if you're wanting some more context about what this series is all about, head back over and check out the playlist where you can watch videos 1 through 4 to get some context. But very basically, this series is meant to accompany our remake along from 2018, in which we're taking either big box store sweaters or sweaters from our grandmother's closet or sweaters that we love but that need to be remade in some way. So we're remaking them into garments that we love to wear. I've been working on this big box store sweater here, which is a cotton sweater, cable front, raglan sleeve, and I have my FO on today. So it's a pretty exciting day around here at the Knitting the Stash yarn room studio. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this finished object. I want to talk to you about digital pattern writing and charts and some ideas for how to do that in this particular installment. I'll talk to you a little bit about scaling patterns, and I have a call for test knitters for this pattern before it goes live. So all of that in today's installment. And what I want to do first is show you the sweater on. So I'm going to move my model back. I'll put some photos in here too, but this way you can actually see the sweater on me in live and in person. This is what it looks like. It's a pretty cool fit, and I've got my compound raglan sleeves, my front cables, and it goes all the way down to the ribbing at the bottom here. So that is the FO, and I love the way that it kind of fits and sits, and I'm very, very happy with it. Let me switch up the model so that I can tell you a little bit more about it. And we're back. As usual, it's easier to talk about a garment when it's not on your body. So I have my sweater over here on the mannequin for a little while so you can get a good glimpse of it. And I want to talk about some of the key features that I knit into this garment, some of the things that are different from the original. And I've been busy writing up the pattern, which is drafted at this point. I'm calling it the Phoenix Pullover, because it's kind of rising out of the ashes of the big box store sweater. And as I said at the beginning, I'm going to be looking to you guys for some test knitters for this pattern before it goes live sometime this fall. So key features. If you'll remember, the original just had a straight regular old raglan sleeve, and I told you guys I was planning on doing a compound raglan, which is what I did here. And you can see that this raglan sits almost kind of vertically, and then quickly kind of goes in at the top. And that's a kind of feature of a raglan, a compound raglan. It sits better on the body if these decreases are a little bit fewer, and then these decreases are happen at a faster rate. So I did follow through with that. I will say that I was talking to you guys a little bit about the reverse stockinette knitting, which is a feature of both the sleeves and the entire back of this sweater. Now this sweater is knit in the round from the bottom up, so there's nothing you can really do about the reverse stockinette in the back. You just have to purl and purl and purl. But I found on the sleeves that my reverse stockinette tension was not as great as my stockinette tension, which is a funny thing to notice after 7 or 8 years of knitting, that there is still much to learn and your hands don't quite know exactly what they're doing when you do something new, such as acres and acres of reverse stockinette. So I did knit one of these sleeves in reverse stockinette, and I believe it was this one, though it's a little bit hard to tell. Once you wash it out, it did, once I washed it, the tension did kind of become a little bit more uniform. But I was given some advice of one of my guildmates just said, oh, come on, just knit the other sleeve in stockinette. So I did. And in the pattern, that's the way I've written it up. You basically knit the sleeve in stockinette up to the armpit, and then you turn it inside out for the join. So it makes it a lot easier and a little bit faster, I think. And I like the way that those sleeves came out. I think it was good to keep the reverse stockinette as a design detail though, because you have this background of reverse stockinette running behind the cables. You have it on the sleeves, and then you have it kind of on the back, which wraps around to the cables. So it's a nice contrast to all of the cabling that happens in the front. It helps the cables kind of pop a little bit. So I knit the yoke up, and that was kind of maybe the more complicated part of the knitting. As I said in the last installment, I'd encourage you guys to write down your patterns fully before you sit down to execute them. And I did that, but I found, as always, when I'm knitting, that certain things needed to be kind of moved around a little bit. Some decisions had to be made on the fly, and I kept track of all of those decisions. So I had my written up pattern that I expected to execute in front of me, and as I was knitting, if I made any changes, I made sure to kind of note those down. So the final pattern, the draft that I have, reflects all of the things that I actually did in the sweater when I was knitting it. And then up here, between the cables and the ribbing for this neckline, I wanted to make sure that they kind of fed right into each other. So there was a little bit of monkey business. It wasn't just a simple knit 2, purl 2, because every once in a while that wouldn't quite line up. So I'd need to make one or knit 2 together to get myself back to the right repetition of the knit 2, purl 2, so that it would kind of line up with the cables a little bit. I like the way that it came out. I also like the fact that this neckline is a little bit more of a kind of boat neck than the original. The original is very much a crew neck, very round, very kind of symmetrical. The ribbing is separated from the body of the sweater, which I'll show you here. You can see that the stitches are very separate from the rest of the body there and kind of picked up. This flows much more, and it has, boat necks are a little bit wider this way than they are this way. So I think it sits really nicely on me, and I think it would sit nicely on a lot of folks with that kind of boat line neckline. I did do some short row shaping, and that not only helped with the raglan decreases, the amount that needed to happen, but it helped to lift up the back. And I think you can see it best in profile here. This back is this much higher than the front. I think you can see the difference there. A couple of inches. So the back has a really nice kind of lift to it. You can see, I think you can see, the way that the back kind of sits on the mannequin there is a little bit higher, and it gives a kind of flattering shape to the shoulders. And when you come around to the front is a little bit lower and kind of sits down on the neck, which I really kind of like. I did a semi-stretchy bind off so that you can get your head in and out. And what I mean by that is I did the stretchy bind off whenever I was binding off my knit stitches, and I did a regular bind off of just purl, slip the stitch over when I was doing the purl stitches. So it's semi-stretchy, which means that it's got a lot of give, but it still has some structure to it, so that it will hold this shape as you're wearing it, which I really like. Now, in the final pattern, I decided to change a couple of things. One is the raglan decrease lines in this sweater, which you can see most easily on the back here probably. I ended up doing a 4-stitch raglan decrease, which I quite like in this particular sweater. I think it lends itself to a little bit of a sporty kind of look to it. But in the final pattern, I decided to go with a 2-stitch decrease seam. So it will look, does this one have? This one doesn't really even have a decrease seam. It has a seam where the pieces were joined, but it doesn't have this feature of a kind of knit raised line of stitches. So I decided to go with a 2-stitch raglan seam, faux raglan seam there in the final pattern. Now I will say that writing up the final pattern wasn't too difficult given my notes, but I did need to read my knitting a little bit for some of it, to remember, for example, when I went from the ribbing on the bottom into the cables there. This setup row includes setting up the cables and doing the increases between the ribbing and the cables. So I had to go back and read my knitting to kind of make sure that I had all of that down for the pattern. And I would highly recommend that if you're working on any kind of pattern that has ribbing going into cables, because it will prevent flare and squinching if you kind of use a good percentage to bring the cables into, or to bring the ribbing into the cables. The other thing you'll note when you guys finally see the pattern is that the front panel has more stitches than the back panel, and that is because cables take up more yarn and pull the fabric inward, and so having more stitches on the front to accommodate the cables means that you'll get the actual measurement more correctly for the front of the body. If you don't increase your stitches for cables, you might end up with a sweater that's like crunched on the front and that has very little ease and just kind of squishes to your body. And all cables are going to conform to your body a little bit, but this one has enough ease in it that it will not do that kind of thing. So I think those are the main pattern details, and I wanted to switch over next to talking to you a little bit about what it's like to write up a pattern. And for some of us, some of you guys, and I know for myself, writing up a garment pattern for the first time can seem like a daunting task. And not only because you're trying to provide instructions about what you did or what you expect other people to do to create this garment, but you might also be working on things like charts or scaling a pattern from not only your size but up to a bunch of different sizes. So let's talk pattern for a little bit, pattern writing. One of the best things you can do is once you have it all written up in a way that you think is comprehensible, to have it test knit. And that is a good check to see if what you're writing, if your instructions are actually readable and understandable by someone else. So that's the next step for me in this pattern. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I've gotten some questions about software that people can use to write up things like charts for cables and color work and things like that. And so I did a little bit of research, and there are a bunch of different online programs. Some of them are free, some of them you pay for access, some of them you purchase. There are things, programs like Stitch Fiddle, Stitch Mastery. There are a bunch of other ones out there. Some of them are available completely online. You just sign up for an account. Stitch Fiddle is one of these, and I tested it out. And you sign up for an account and you can use the program to create different kinds of charts. So this, for example, is a Stitch Fiddle chart that I was setting up for the cabling. The thing about something like Stitch Fiddle is that it has a limited dictionary of stitches. So if you're working on something like I was working on this cable in the front that has some particularly specific symbols for it, because it's a 5x5 2-1-2 right or left cable cross. Something like Stitch Fiddle or some of the other free software programs may not have all of the symbols that you're looking for, so you might want to check that at the very beginning, see if they have your symbols, because otherwise you might get halfway through making a chart and realize that you don't have the symbols that you need. Now other programs like Stitch Mastery will, I'm just going to pull it up here real quick. Stitch Mastery is a professional kind of charting software. Here's their web page for you. And the cool thing about Stitch Mastery is that you basically purchase it and it has so many different symbols. It has charting abilities, it has copy and paste abilities, it has abilities to check your work for you, almost like a computerized tech editor who could check that all of your pattern writing looks about like it's supposed to look. The thing about Stitch Mastery is that it is somewhat expensive, maybe prohibitively so for some people. I think it's about £60 to purchase it. And so I was looking into all these options, and then I also found an option for just using Excel, which is a Microsoft Office product. A lot of us have Word or Excel or some version of a spreadsheet. OpenOffice you can download for free, and that has a kind of spreadsheet in it. If you have a spreadsheet on your computer, you can make knitting charts for free. And that is kind of cool, especially if you're a beginning designer and you don't want to put out a lot of money into this at the very beginning. You want to kind of work into this slowly. So I ended up going into Excel, doing a little bit of teaching of myself of how to do this. And Stitch Mastery, that program I was just talking about, actually has several sets of fonts that you can download for free. And you download those fonts into your font library, and then you can use those fonts in Excel to create your own charts for free, which is really, really cool. So let me show you. This is how I was using Excel for the charts. And you set up Excel to have the cell width and height look a little bit more like a knitting stitch. So your cells tend to be a little wider than they are tall, so a little shorter and a little wider. And there are tons of places online that you can look for those kinds of percentages or ratios for what would be ideal. I showed you knitting graph paper earlier in an earlier installment. It's a similar idea. You're creating your own knitting graph paper in Excel. You're downloading the font dictionaries from Stitch Mastery, and then you're inserting them with all kinds of hotkeys. That's the only thing about doing it this way, is you have to be a little bit willing to put in the time and do a little bit more legwork, because you're not just buying a pre-made program for yourself. But it's free, again, that's great. So I would sit there with Excel open on one window, and then my PDF guide to the hotkeys for the Stitch Mastery font open in another window. And as long as you're in the right font in Excel, you can, do things like you hit D and suddenly a 2x2 cable cross shows up in your cell and it looks cool. So there's a little bit more to it, a little more time commitment involved if you're going to go the free route. But I think it's really worth it, especially if you're a new designer and you want to save costs but still produce really great charts for things like cables, lace, or color work. So the other bit I wanted to talk to you about is scaling patterns. So when I put together the Phoenix pattern, I was basing it on this sample, which I knit in a size 32, and to wear it for my bust size is about a 34. So knitting at 32 meant that it was 0 ease. So it's kind of like a form-fitting garment, which is what I intended, because that's how my big box store sweater kind of fits me. But then, so writing the design for a size 32, given that I have the sample right in front of me, is a fairly simple task. I had my instructions, I had my notes to myself, and I had my garment. So reading my knitting, looking at my notes, writing up, it just involves kind of translating that into words in English and sentences, like what did I do, when did I do it, and how did I do it. Once I had all of that written up for the pattern, the next step is scaling. And scaling, for those of you who, if you've ever worked with a pattern, you always see kind of like different designers do it different ways, but you'll see like, the first size, and then there'll be a set of parentheses, and then there'll be other numbers for the other sizes. And it really is it's a lot of sweater math, basically, to move from one size to the next. Once you have your basic instructions, you're just doing a little bit of different math to make things work out. Now, that is absolutely true. If you're doing a sweater that's this kind of simple body raglan, maybe you don't have any cables on the front of it or lace or anything else, just a straight up plain sweater like this, right? The sizing or the scaling on something like this would be fairly simple, because you're just inputting numbers based on your gauge to get the right numbers out. And if you've ever done a pattern modification, gone to the schematic, looked at what the designers intended, gauge measurements, and look are, and then taken that math and done your own math and ratios and percentages and et cetera, to create your own size, you've done sweater math. And if you've done sweater math, you can do scaling. So the scaling of a pattern really just, a lot of it is just doing the sweater math for another size based on the same gauge that you already have. Now, where that gets tricky is in places like a yoke of a sweater, or if you're working on a cable panel. Now, I designed this sweater so that it would be scalable in large part, because the cable panel throughout whatever size you're going to make of this pattern stays the same. What changes are the number of stitches here on the side seam. So for my scaling, when it comes to the body of the sweater, the very basic thing that I did was to say, okay, in my size, I have 6 stitches over here on this side panel, side seam. So if I'm going to scale up and add stitches so that this gets wider for the next size, the next bust size up, I'm going to add my stitches here on the side. I'm not touching the panel. So the front panel in this part of the body is exactly the same in every size of the sweater. What you're changing is the amount of stitches that go around on the sides. So that's one way to do scaling. And a lot of folks who do cable and lace patterns will tell you that they insert various places where it's plain stockinette or reverse stockinette, and they can use those places as nice little spots to hide increases and decreases, to hide issues of scale when they're doing different kinds of sweater math and adding stitches or subtracting stitches. So that's what I chose to do with this sweater. Now where that gets tricky is up here in the yoke, because while your cable panel might be the same for each size, the excess amount of stitches that you have over here that you're decreasing into and decreasing your sleeves into, that gets a little bit funny, and you have to think not only about the number of stitches around, but you have to think about the distance between here and here. I use some standard size charts to kind of guesstimate the measurement from, say, an armpit up to like a collarbone, and you can get those free online. They're standard sizing charts that'll give you those kinds of measurements for different bust sizes. But the important thing to think about is this distance here is going to be different if you're doing a size 32 to a size 40. That'll give you you have not only a lot more stitches this way, but you're going to have a little more ground to cover this way. And so as you're doing your yoke, especially if it's a raglan decreases or compound raglan, you have to think about the number of rows that you have to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And if you're making a bigger size, it means that you have more rows to accomplish what you want to accomplish, and you have to adjust your yoke shaping and sizing and your raglan decreases to fit that number of rows that you have from the armpit or bust line up to the neck or collar of the sweater. So those were things that I found challenging with writing this pattern. I think a lot of folks maybe start out writing patterns that aren't for garments, that aren't sized to fit a body, because those kinds of choices, those kinds of scaling issues don't exist really with shawls or with even with hats so much, or mittens or something like that. But with a garment, there are a lot of different considerations to take into account. But it's totally possible. You can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. It's sweater math. You just have to make certain kinds of choices as you go along and keep in mind certain kinds of principles about how people's bodies actually work. When you're scaling up, you're not just scaling up this way, you're scaling up this way as well. So that is the basics of this particular FO. This is the Phoenix pullover, and it will be coming at you, I'm hoping in the next month or two once the test knitting is done. So that leads me to the final bit here, which is an announcement and a request. I would love to have some of you who have been following this Better Sweater series from the beginning be test knitters for this pattern. So what I would say is this: if you're interested in test knitting the Phoenix pullover, please shoot me an email at knittingthestash@gmail.com and let me know what size you might be interested in, and send me a link to your Ravelry project page so I can have a look at your portfolio and figure out who might be really great test knitters for this sweater. The sizes I have right now, I knit the 32. I'd like to have somebody knit the 34, 36, 38, and 40, ideally. But there might be some overlap if that's, we'll see what comes of all of this, if there's a lot of interest. But I really hope that some of you will take up the call and be test knitters for this. I will send you the pattern once you're selected as a test knitter, and what I'd like from you is some feedback, not only about how it's going, how the actual knitting is going, and if you have questions, but what you think of the pattern, how it's laid out, if it's missing something, if you feel like you'd need more instruction here, there, or where. Critique is always welcome. I just really want to know from my knitting community what you think about the pattern and how it can be improved. So all suggestions would be welcome in this process. So get in touch, and I really hope that a bunch of you will be test knitters for the Phoenix pullover. And finally, I want to send some encouragement out to those of you especially who have been in the Ravelry thread, working away on your own remake along projects. So I will make an announcement in that thread about a giveaway, a couple giveaways, I hope, in the next week or so. So stay tuned. If you are not part of that Ravelry group, come on over, make yourself at home, pick up a remake along project and get started. And if you've already been in there, like so many of you have been, helping each other, asking questions, offering advice, there are some giveaways in store, and I really appreciate all of your participation. So that is it for Better Sweater installment number 5. Thank you all for coming and tuning in and hanging out with me, especially not only for this day of the finished object, but all the way through this series. It's been a real pleasure, and I'd love it if you wanted to send in questions. If there's a bunch of questions, maybe there'll be installment number 6, where I answer whatever questions you have about design and pattern writing, and I just love to hear from you. So thanks so much, and I will talk to you guys later.